Hey guys, it's the Villaman here, home theater enthusiast and lover of all things tech, and the formed T1 is the smallest case you can fit an RTX 4090 in. So that's the case I chose when I decided to rebuild my current gaming PC, which I use for TV reviews, which I call the Villa Consola. Now that case had, or that PC had, an RTX 3080 graphics card as well as a Ryzen 5800X CPU. Now, instead of transplanting the PC into the new case and adding the RTX 4090, I decided to throw that all out and start from scratch and actually use a faster processor, which actually has a higher TDP. So this is that build. Stick around. Perfect. Now this formed mini ITX case is pretty small, coming in at a tad under 10 liters, but it can still surprisingly hold a triple slot card. And my previous case, the Sliger CL520, that one came in at 8 liters, so it can only hold a dual slot card. So that's why I had to go with the 3080 at the time, and even so I had to undervolt my CPU because the cooler I was using was the Alpenphone Blackridge, and that one, it couldn't necessarily handle all the TDP of the 5800X, especially in a case that size. So I had to undervolt the CPU so the temps wouldn't get out of control. But even so, just running some benchmarks with the same cooler in the formed T1 case, the temps for 3D Mark and for some other benchmarks I ran went all the way up to 84 degrees Celsius, which is really high. And those temps were even with the two exhaust fans up top, and they were working full time, let me tell you that. So that's why I decided I would go with an AIO water cooler instead. And the one that I got was a low profile one with a low profile radiator and low profile fans, but I replaced those fans with some Noctuas, which were a bit thicker but quieter and didn't have any RGB, which I didn't want in this build. Doing that though, one of my concerns was the AIO for the CPU just intaking the hot air exhaust from the GPU in the case, which would result in higher CPU temps, but that actually turned out to not be the case. Because one, the AIO had a larger surface area than the Alpenphone Blackridge CPU cooler, the air cooler, so that by itself, it has more area to work with to dissipate the heat, and it also has two fans which are both thicker than the low profile Noctua that was attached to the Alpenphone air cooler. And what we got was a reduction in CPU temps across the board. For example, in Cyberpunk 2077, the CPU temps went from a high of 84 degrees with 69 degrees for the graphics card to 67 degrees for the CPU, while the temps for the GPU remained at 69 degrees. So as you can see, just by that one example, there was a huge reduction in CPU temps, and that's with a faster CPU with a higher TDP, the 7800X3D. It wasn't just limited to Cyberpunk though. Even for Hogwarts Legacy, the temps for the CPU went from a high of 84 degrees to 77 degrees Celsius, and for the 3D Mark tests, which had temps from 84 degrees and 76 degrees depending on the test, it went to a low of 67 degrees as well. So 67 degrees is pretty much the low of the CPU that it remained at under load. So when it didn't have load, it dropped to much lower than that, of course. But when it was really working, then it went up to a high of 69 degrees, and when I stress tested using 3D Mark, it went all the way up to 72 degrees. So even in the stress tests, it still wasn't as high as it was with the air cooler. So I'd say that's pretty successful. And you may have noticed I used two different fans on the AIO. I used a full-size Fantex 120mm fan and the low profile Noctua 120mm, because on the Noctua side there was the motherboard for clearance, so it didn't have enough space, while on the right hand side where the Fantex was, there was only the power supply cables under that, so there wasn't really an issue fitting that one over there on the right hand side. And since the sides of the case have a mesh design, then it can still pull in that cool air from outside and not just the hot air that the GPU is exhausting. But the most challenging part of building in a case like this is not the component placing, because once you have the right components, then you can pretty much fit them in no problem. The biggest problem or biggest issue I found was with cable management. Now, the cables play a huge part in having a successful build, because one, you need some very flexible cables, because you have to be doing some pretty creative bending to fit it into every nook and cranny. You can't just get it out of the way of the actual components. All that said, going from a 5800X to a 7800X3D, even though the 7800X3D is a better CPU in a lot of instances, for 4K gaming with the same graphics card isn't that big of a difference. It really isn't. It is definitely not worth buying an entirely new CPU for that. So you are better off just waiting, if you have a 5800X that is, and you're playing at 4K, you're better off just waiting for the next gen, because it's not a big enough leap to actually warrant buying that new CPU. I don't think so, at least. If you're gaming in 1440p or something of that sort, then outcome may be entirely different. I've seen where the CPU, the benchmarks are plus upwards of 20% better than the 5800X. So if you're gaming below 4K, then that might not be the same experience you have. Overall, I really like this build because it's so small but so dense. You can tell that there's a lot of stuff just packed inside of it, and the overall case is smaller than the box that the RTX 4090 came in. I'm really looking forward to putting this PC to work, you know, testing out the gaming performance of these new 2023 TVs. So if you're interested in seeing any of that, then you need to subscribe if you haven't done that yet. But yeah, I've left a link to everything I've included in this build in the description below, and let me know if you have any questions or comments in the comments below as well. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like the video if you liked it and subscribe if you haven't. Until next time, this has been your friend and neighborhood Villaman saying be safe and peace.